So as a follow-up to the previous video on methods of weight room progression, I wanted to get a little bit more to the weeds on application. It was something I had neither the time nor the energy to really address in detail last time. I also didn't want the video to be like 4 hours long because I'm not Greg Nuckols. So what I want to talk about today is look at each of the progressions, primarily the first two, in terms of when I think they're appropriate, and predominantly how you apply them across multiple sets. Because I got one question about that I didn't really have time to get into because it makes it a little bit more complicated, but it also, there's more variability. You have more options in what you may choose to do depending on the situation. Also, since I'm cutting from the previous video, I noticed that in my little summary charts it says summary of progressions, or it says summer of progressions rather than summary, because I don't know how to type apparently, and I don't proofread my stuff. Anyway, let's get to it. All right, the single progression. Here you're manipulating one variable. All right, so in the single progression, you pick a fixed repetition count or number, 3, 5, 8, whatever. You start with a given weight, and then you increase the weight on the bar based on your change in reps in reserve or rep speed. Basically, when you adapt and get stronger, you add weight, but you don't change the reps. Single progression, one variable. So in some ways, the single progression is the easiest because you've only got the one variable to manipulate. However, knowing when to add weight to the bar in this rep range does require that you either have a psycho coach like me watching every set, like I do with my power lifter, or a pretty decent feel for bar speed or reps in reserve. Because you're adding weight when you feel like you have gotten the adaptation, when you have gotten stronger, when you know that you are able to do it. So let's say you're targeting a given rep range at 1 reps in reserve, which should be pretty hard. Not grindy failure, because again, I'm not advocating failure. However, hard. Well, when that drops to where it's 2 reps in reserve, where that final rep is faster than it used to be, or even 3, depending on mainly what percentage increments you have available, then you go up at the next workout. It's simple, but if you're really shitty at estimating reps in reserve or bar speed, it may not be that applicable. So when do I use it? Well, there's probably a couple primary situations. One is for people that are just shit at adding reps or just hate doing reps, right? Sumi, my power lifter, hated doing reps. She just hated them, high reps, which is fine. She's a power lifter. We didn't need a lot of reps, but she wasn't particularly good at adding them. And I mentioned the trainee I had years ago who on chins, like if I'd set up a rep progression, he never would have gotten there. So I just kept the rep count fixed and added weight when I felt like he was ready. For lower repetition ranges, it really has more to do with exercise choice. But generally speaking, certain exercises don't really do well in low repetition ranges. Like you're not going to do lateral raises for triples, by and large. But for very highly technical movements, where adding reps to a set is probably not a good idea, that's where I think the single progression probably shines. So again, for her training, said she only did singles in the competition lifts. She was shit for reps. Her technique would fall apart. I preferred quality and specificity for her. I'm not saying that's how you should train. I'm saying that's what I did with her. So on her squats, for example, she would warm up. She would do 2 singles at like 85% and then maybe 6 at 90. Kind of a Prilipin-esque cable. Smaller female, lower absolute weights. I'm not getting as specific. When her 8th rep moved faster than it had the week before, that told me it was time to add a little bit of weight. Or occasionally, if I felt like she was ready, I might test that final rep 5 pounds heavier and just see how it moved. But again, I was in the gym every day with her. She could not have done this by herself because she was shit for reps in reserve. It does require the ability to do that. And we didn't use any tech to measure bar speed because I have eyes. I did the same thing for her heavy assistance movements. So for squat, she did heavy good mornings. For deadlift, she did heavy rack pulls one day. She did heavy RDLs, heavy trap bar deadlift on another day. For flat bench, she did heavy dumbbell bench, pause dumbbell bench on a different day, and close grips. And those were for triples. So again, Specificity, this was meant to support the primary movement, so let it go heavier, and she shit for reps. She would have dropped off too much weight. So single progressions, I think, really shine there in those complex movements where you're just not going to go from a heavy triple and try to add reps to that set because your technical quality will probably fall apart, which means you're probably going to get hurt. And again, while I have no science to support this, I have generally found that when people are injured, they don't make fantastic progress. So that's when I tend to think it's most appropriate. It can be used for other exercises. We use single progressions for Haller's stuff because she hated reps. So on her leg presses or her leg extensions or her leg curls, she would just do sets of 8. And when I saw that the 8th rep was no longer grindy, I would add weight at the next workout. It really wasn't that complicated. And on average, you know, that was about every 3 or 4 weeks. She would just stay at the same fixed workload that was heavy enough. When she adapted, I would add weight. So the next thing I want to look at is how you apply a single progression to multiple sets. Because with Sumi, she would do one top set of 3. She would pyramid up. We do 3 by 3 to one top set. And I only cared about the top set. And when I saw that moving better, I would add weight. But what if you're doing multiple sets across? Say you're doing 3 by 3 or 5 by 5 or 4 by 8 at the same weight. How do you apply the single progression? How do you know when it's time to add weight? And there's really kind of fundamentally 2 ways to do it. The first way is to keep the weight on all sets the same until the final set. You see that adaptation. So let's say you were doing 3 by 3 in some exercise, and your goal was to do it at 1 reps in reserve. Over some series of workouts, hopefully, you would get to the point that the first set would be easier as you were getting stronger. It might actually be at 2 to 3 reps in reserve, and then 2 reps in reserve, and then eventually that third set becomes easier. That's when it's time to add weight to all the sets. And it looks like this. So here's a completely made-up example. So workout 1, you do 3 by 3 at 2 reps in reserve on the final set. That's what you get. Workout 2, the same. Workout 3, that first set's a little bit easier. 3 reps in reserve. Then you get 2 sets of 3 at 2. That ends up repeating. Workout 5, that first set is now much easier. It's at 4 reps in reserve. Second set is at 3 reps in reserve, but the third set is still at 2 reps in reserve, which is your goal. That happens again, and then in workout 7, that first set, 4 reps in reserve. Second set, 3 reps in reserve. Third set is at 3 reps in reserve. That's the signal to add weight to all 3 sets, which should bring you back to 3 by 3 at 2 reps in reserve. And that doesn't just apply to triples. It's any repetition range you're using, 3, 5, 8, 12, it doesn't matter. The point is that you're doing 5 by 5, 4 by 8, 3 by 12, 3 by 15, whatever it is. You add weight when the final set has adapted to the point that it's easier than you want it to be. I think this type of approach is really particularly good for low repetition training in terms of waiting till you hit the final set at the new, easier intensity before you add weight. And I think this also goes back to what I talked about in the triple progression in the last video. In terms of when you're working with very heavy weights and low repetitions, there's an element of mastering that weight before you increase. Because unless you're just excruciatingly advanced, at which point you're making gains at a snail's pace anyway, pushing the weight up too quickly in low repetition ranges of heavy weights, your technique just tends to fall apart, and you're better off spending those couple of weeks handling the same weight, or however long it takes, before you add weight across all the sets, just to make sure you're really ready and can do it safely. Now you can see that there's 2 potential flaws with this. One is that as you get stronger, the first set of the exercise might feel a little too light. 4 reps reserve is still within the goal intensity, right? It's not like that first set is no longer a training effect, but it's just easier than it was. So assuming like if your goal is to keep all 3 sets at the same intensity, that won't work. But again, in low repetition ranges, I don't see that as a drawback. It just means that you absolutely fucking own that weight. That's a good thing. The other problem is that Not everybody can do this. Some people, they might feel the first set get easier, and then the second set's harder, and that third set, because of cumulative fatigue for whatever reason, simply never gets to the point that they're ready to add weight. It's sort of the single progression equivalent of not being able to add reps well. It depends on a whole bunch of variables that would take me forever to try to explain, but one of them would probably be relative strength. Obviously, if you're moving some really tremendously heavy weights for triples, even if it's lighter, that first set may wreck you. It will depend on rest intervals. If you're using short rest intervals, that second set, third set are going to fall off. You shouldn't be using short rest intervals for low repetitions and very heavy weights to begin with. And then there's just individual variation. Some people are really good at repeating. Some aren't. There's also how close you are to 0 reps in reserve, right? Like it's going to be a lot harder to repeat 1 reps in reserve than 2 or even 3. So there are variables, but really the point of this is that if you're just the kind of person under whatever situation that final set, however many you're doing, never gets to the point that you're supposed to add weight, well, you can't just stay there forever. So in that case, the second method you could use across multiple sets would be to adjust the sets individually. This will be way easier to explain with a visual, so here's another completely made-up training example. All right, so first workout, you're doing 100 whatevers for 3 sets of 8 and 2 reps in reserve across the board. Workout 2, you're no stronger. Do that workout again. Now workout 3, you've gotten a little bit stronger. The first set is now 100 by 8 at 3 reps in reserve. And then the second and third sets, 100 by 2 by 8 at 2 reps in reserve. So what you do now, workout 4, is you adjust the first set upwards, 105 by 8 at 2 reps in reserve. Then the second and third sets, 100 by 2 by 8 at 2 reps in reserve. Into workout 5, first set, 105 by 8, it's still 2 reps in reserve. But now the second set, 100 by 8, has become 3 reps in reserve. You've gotten a little bit stronger. And then the final set, 100 by 8, 2 reps in reserve. So workout 6, 105 by 2 sets of 8 at 2 reps in reserve. Final set, 100 by 8 at 2 reps in reserve. Workout 7, 105 by 2 by 8 at 2 reps in reserve. Your third set is now become 3 reps in reserve. So workout 8, it's now 105 by 3 sets of 8 at 2 reps in reserve. Rinse and repeat. I'm sure some of you can already see an additional complexity, which is that at some point, that the weight increase you make on the first set, that may get too easy. In which case it goes to 110, the second set's 105, the third set's 100, and you end up with this weird staircase pattern where you may never actually be doing the same weight across all 3 sets. You'll be adjusting each one of them individually based on how they're adapting. This is what Charles Poliquin used to call just a reverse pyramid, although you would sort of deliberately warm up, jump to your heaviest set, and then go back down to account for fatigue. And I'll get into that in a lot more detail in the next video. But you kind of see the point of this, is that you keep adjusting the weights individually on sets as they get easier to try to keep them within sort of a goal intensity range. I do think this is probably more appropriate for higher repetition and hypertrophy training. Right? Heavy strength stuff, like we know factually that you can be further away from 0 reps in reserve and still make gains. In hypertrophy, you need to stay in that, 1 to 4 reps in reserve range, unless you're on all of Mike Israel's drugs, in which case you can train like a pansy and still grow. So it's conceivable that, that first set, as you go, gets to 5 reps in reserve, and you might end up adjusting them all individually. And once again, there's huge variability in this, in terms, that when this is or might even happen. Shorter rest intervals are going to make it a lot harder than longer rest intervals. Also, with very higher repetition ranges, it's probably going to be much more difficult to ever get that final set where you want it to be, just because of the metabolic fatigue. Without extremely long rest intervals, you're going to be accumulating acidosis and stuff, and it's a lot easier doing sets of 8 to get there where that final set is where you need it to be to add weight to it. And across 4 sets of 15, you might never get there. There are also situations where, again, like with the lower repetition example, like if you keep bumping up the first set and the second set, that third set may never actually get easier, simply because you're coming into it with more fatigue every single workout as you individually adjust those previous sets. which is fine, again, from a hypertrophy standpoint. And again, I'll explain how to really do that more methodically in the next video. But that's just another way to do it. So again, I would probably, do method 1 for low repetition, heavy weights, especially technical compound exercises, to make sure you really own that weight before you go up. And I'd be more inclined to use method number 2, where you're adjusting the sets individually as they get easier for higher repetition ranges, and also probably more specifically for hypertrophy training. All right, let's move on. So onto the double progression, where again, now we're manipulating 2 variables, which is the number of repetitions being done and the weight on the bar. So summarizing the double progression, usually set a repetition range, typically a 3 to 5 rep spread. Some common examples, 5 to 8, 8 to 10, 8 to 12, 12 to 15, 15 to 20. You may use larger ones in specific cases, usually when the weight increments are staggering relative to what you're lifting, and you just have to build it up, like lateral raises from 6 to 15. And then weight is added when the top rep count is achieved. So again, in a double progression, just looking at one set. Let's say you pick a repetition range of 8 to 12. You start and you can do 8 repetitions at a given weight. Over some time period, however long it takes, you build up to 12 repetitions. Once you reach that point, that's a sign that it's time to add weight. So you add some percentage, depending on what you have available, all those factors I talked about in the previous video. That will typically drop your repetitions back down, and then you build back up. Now, as I mentioned in the last video and then earlier in this one major drawback of the single progression is that in order to know when it's time to add weight, you either have to be really good with repetitions in reserve or bar speed, or I guess have tech to do it. I'm old and fear change, so I don't. Or you need to have a psycho coach watching every rep to know when to add weight. Not everyone is good at that, or they don't have a psycho coach. So in that case, the double progression builds in, I'm going to say it's a type of auto-regulation, and it kind of is and kind of isn't, and I'm being qualified so that all of you pedantic assholes don't crawl up my ass over the terminology. But what it does is it gives you an indicator. I can do 12 reps with this weight. It's time for me to add weight. It can be good. Again, there are those specific movements where the weight increment is so staggeringly above the percentage-wise, what you can realistically add to a single progression, that you may have to use it simply to represent getting strong enough to be ready to add weight. Reiterate that in general, you wouldn't, or rather, I certainly wouldn't use a double progression in very low repetition ranges, right? Only certain movements, squat, bench, deadlift, bent over row, maybe overhead press, clean and jerk, snatch, really lend themselves to like triples and below. You're probably not doing quality sets of 3 in the lateral raise, for example. And these aren't movements that, by and large, are going to lend themselves to a lot of double progressions. Like, again, you're just not going to see a power lifter try to build from a heavy set of 3 to a heavy set of 5, by and large. Now, I did include 5 to 8 as a repetition range, and that's sort of a more hypertrophy-oriented range. You could probably do that on squats if your technique is really good. You could absolutely do it on hacks. You could absolutely do it on leg presses. Deadlifts, probably not. I wouldn't generally recommend it. Bench press, sure, sets of 5 to 8. Compound chest work, compound back work, overhead press, things like that. But below about 5 reps, I don't think double progressions are a particularly good idea. I would rather use the single progression, and I'll talk about the triple progression again in the end for about 12 seconds. So in the examples I'm going to give, I'm going to be using higher repetition ranges, more of a classic hypertrophy zone, which I think is where double progressions have traditionally been used. But yeah, anything below 5s, because of the exercises that tend to lend themselves to those very low repetitions, a double progression is probably going to be a very, very, very bad idea. And since I'm sure some asshole in the comments go, well, I read about a guy who did it, that's great. I'm speaking in averages. I'm speaking in the majority. Dredging out some elite level strength athlete who started lifting when they were 5, who can get away with this safely, is great. First, there's the issue of survivorship bias. They're the ones that made it work. But second, you're not them. So let me move on. I'd mention again another application for this, and one of the ways I tended to use it was for relatively newer trainees who, number one, have no concept of reps in reserve or bar speed, but also who are still learning to generate intensity and push themselves. By giving them a repetition range, when I add weight and it brings it down to whatever the low end of the range is, it gives them a target. Right? They may not be ready to add weight for technical reasons. I want them to go and learn, okay, I've done 8, but maybe I could do 1 or 2 more, and they push a little bit harder. Or if I'm training them, I will talk them through it. When they think they're done, I'll have them get another rep or 2. It's also beneficial for people that either have very variable performance, but who also get really hit hard when they don't make exacting targets. Right? If you tell a trainee to get 8 with 100 pounds, and they're having an off day, and they only get 6, then they may feel like a failure. It depends on the trainee, depends on the person. By giving them a range, like I said, it's kind of an auto-regulation that when they feel good, they may get more reps, and when they feel bad, they may only get the lower count. By giving them that range, you give them that option. It also prevents them from trying to get the reps no matter what. Same thing if I say, I want 12 reps, they're going to get to 12 no matter what it fucking takes, no matter how bad their form breaks, no matter what they have to do. If I tell them, I want you to do between 8 and 12 repetitions, but only as many as you can do in perfect form, that tends to prevent that shit. So those are some of the reasons I use it. I didn't use it with Sumi, because as I mentioned, she hates reps, but I am using it with another older female powerlifter I coach, because she's relatively new to the game. And so on her hypertrophy-based donkey work, I give her repetition range. And I tell her to learn to push so you can learn to generate a little bit more intensity over time, and also to give her a target so that when she can get however many sets and the final set of 12 is at a certain point, then it's time to add weight, which brings me to how to do this across multiple sets. Honestly, everything I said about the single progression applies here. That there are basically 2 methods to adjusting the double progression across multiple sets. The first is that you stay with the same weight for however many number of sets until you can get the final set at the highest target repetition range, at which point you add weight to all sets across. Here's an example. And I'm going to hate typing this up. So another completely made-up example. So the initial workout goal is 3 sets of 8 to 12 repetitions. Workout 1, 100 whatevers by 3 by 8. Workout 2, first set you get 100 by 10. Second set you can only get 100 by 2 by 8. Workout 3, 100 by 12, 100 by 10, 100 by 8. Workout 4, 100 by 12, 100 by 11, 100 by 10. Workout 5, you get the first 2 sets 100 by 12. And the third set still only 100 by 10. Workout 6, 100 by 2 by 12, 100 by 11. Finally, in workout 7, you get 100 for all 3 sets of 12. And then workout 8, you add weight to 105, which is going to drop you back to 3 sets, probably of 8. And then you do it all over again. So that seems pretty straightforward. And I'm not saying that's what the repetition numbers, that they'll go up in exactly that pattern or that order. You're getting cumulative fatigue. It's going to depend, again, on the person, to a degree, the exercise, rest intervals. If you're determined to use short rest intervals, you're going to get way bigger rep drop-offs in terms of it's just as an example. Basically, you wait till you can get all 3 sets at the top end of the repetition range, or all the sets that your goal is. And once you do that, you add weight, which will invariably drop back the reps, and then you build up again over what time period. Now, same comments as on the single progression. 2 potential problems with that are that, 1, that first set will get progressively easier as you go. Now, probably not as much as the single progression, just because it's more repetitions, and it will probably stay in a sufficient range to be a training effect. But as importantly, you may run into the problem or the issue that, again, depending on rest interval and who you are and all kinds of different shit, like you may never be able to get all of the sets at the same repetition range. That is, you may never get that final set to the top end of the rep range. You just might not. In which case, you end up with the exact same situation before, which is that you start adjusting the weights individually. So that when that first set gets to 12, we bump the weight up, even if the second, then go back for the second and third sets and do the same thing. So again, I'm going to hate typing this out, but here we go. So again, another made-up example that's way more convoluted. So again, the goal workout, 3 sets of 8 to 12. Start out in workout 1, 100 whatevers for 3 sets of 8. Second workout, you get 100 by 10, and then 100 for 2 sets of 8. Workout 3, 100 by 12, 100 by 10, 100 by 8. Now you adjust the first set up, 105 by 8. Maybe you get 100 by 11 on the second set, and then 100 by 10. So they're all kind of progressing at their own rate. Maybe, maybe not. You're getting whatever you're getting. Workout 5, 105, you now get 10. The second set, you're 100 by 12. The third set, due to fatigue, you only get 100 by 10. Workout 6, you do 105 by 11. You do the second set at 105. You're more tired, maybe you only get 8. Maybe you get 9. I can't say. Third set, 100 by 11. Workout 7, 105 by 12 by 9, followed by 100 by 12. Then in the next workout, all 3 sets that are 105, and maybe you get 12, 10, 9, or 12, 10, 8, or 12, 12, 10, or 12, 12, 11. There's no way to really say, and you can see that this one gets really convoluted really fast, because as each set gets, adjusted and is being presumably tried to progress with each workout, you're carrying more cumulative fatigue. So if that first set goes up in weight, that will make you more tired in the second set. It may take 2 workouts to progress from where it was, or it may not. There's no way to really be able for me to tell. You get what you get. And the point of it all being that you end up adjusting the sets individually based on when that set gets to 12, when that individual set, you adjust it up, probably drops the rep range down, keep the other ones, but now you're trying to progress that first set while progressing the second and third set in terms of reps, and then as they each individually hit the top range. Like I said, you end up with some really complicated staggering issues. And you have the same issue as the last time where you may end up at a point where that first set gets to 105 by 12 and is getting too easy, so maybe you adjust it to 110, the second set's still only at 105 going up, and the third set's at 100, where again you end up with this reverse pyramid, which is fine too. You can add another complexity. Go either Google dynamic double progression, and hopefully I'll remember to put the link in the notes this time because I forgot on the last video, which describes an approach where you're not only manipulating weight and reps, but you're also trying to adhere to a certain reps in reserve on each individual set. So it wouldn't be just that you got 12 with a given weight. If your goal was to stay at 2 reps in reserve, you wouldn't go up till you got that set of 12 at 2 reps in reserve. So if you hit 12 and it was an all-out set, you don't actually add weight. I said, I'll give you the link, go find it. I will do a terrible job of describing it. It gets really complicated. The point of this again being, in certain situations where you may simply, either the first set or any individual set is getting too easy at the top end of the range, you may want to adjust it independently. Or you're in a situation where the latter sets never are going to go up just due to cumulative fatigue. And again, exercise choice. How good you are at repeating the weights, probably how heavy it is, rest intervals. If you take 3 minutes between sets, you'll find that you're able to progress all the sets to the top end of the rep range a lot more easily than with a minute. So again, lots of variables. Focus on sort of the examples here that I'm trying to give you. Again, as far as application, I already mentioned some of the reasons that I use double progressions. I tend to go with method 1 in most cases, even for like hypertrophy systems, my generic bulking routine. I kind of want people to wait until they can get all the sets at the top end of the rep range, just because it tends to keep people from adding weight probably sooner than they should. But again, if you're in a situation where that's not going to work, just because you're not able to ever do it, you may need to adjust them independently. And finally, then there's the triple progression, where you are manipulating the weight on the bar, the number of sets, and the number of repetitions. So with the triple progression, you generally start with a fixed weight on the bar, a fixed number of sets, and a fixed number of repetitions. Then you add sets and reps in some pattern to some upper limit, at which point you add weight and drop back to the original sets and reps, and then build up again, and you try not to go crazy from boredom. And even though I left it out of the last video and out of the summary, I did come across some article that showed a triple progression that actually used a repetition range. So you started with like 4 sets of 8 to 12, and then at some point you added a 5th set of 8 to 12. And you know what? Number one, you don't have to worry. None of what I've just talked about as far as a single double progression applies here because it's built into the system, right? You're already building up sets and reps across, well, you're building up sets. So you've already got multiple sets that are being adjusted with a fixed weight anyway. I mean, I guess if you add a repetition range, it gets a million times more complicated. But here's the other thing. I've never used a triple progression ever in my career. I cannot think of a time that I would use it in any situation. But that has to do more with my own personal philosophy. I don't like set progression schemes. I know they became popular, but what got left out is the people are escalating their set count with their drug count. I'm very much a pick an optimal volume, whatever that may be for an exercise, the context, the individual, the goal, and just don't fuck with it. Yeah, I might fuck with repetition ranges if I use a double progression, but if I want someone doing 14 to 16 heavy sets a week, I'm just going to have them do 14 to 16 sets. And I'm going to use a single progression with Sumi because she hates doing reps. I use a double progression with my other lifter because she's at a stage where she needs that on her hypertrophy work. I use single progressions for both of them on both the competition list and the assistance work. But I personally see no point in starting at what I consider a suboptimal volume, building up to what I consider an excessive volume, and then falling back. So I got nothing more to say about the triple progression other than the whole issue that I've discussed in this video doesn't apply, which doesn't matter because I've never had any reason to use one, ever. And I can't think of any situation that I would. I'm not saying that it's bad. I'm not saying that it's wrong. Clearly some great, very strong lifters back in the history of the sport very much did that. And that may be the application when you're doing really stunningly heavy weights and need a way to progress where you can't do what I would call an optimal volume initially. But I've never trained anybody in that situation. So that's all I got. Let me sum up. Okay, I realized after I thought I'd finished this thing and exported it and uploaded it that I actually have a slight correction to what I just said about never using a triple progression or a set progression. I have used one in extremely specific contexts, which is beginner training, where I'm starting them with a single set, always of a double progression, and as they start to develop fitness, I might add sets. Now, it's not a true triple progression because I don't build up the sets and then drop them back, but I will be first adding reps and weight, and then at some point I will add a second set or a third set, depending on the situation. I've also used something vaguely similar coming back from layoffs, right? So post-COVID, I hadn't trained for a while because my gym was closed, and when I went back, I'm a big believer, because I'm old and broken, just in general, of shaking out the cobwebs, and I had a lot of cobwebs, so I started with low volume, low intensity. One light set, 8 to 12, just to get back in the gym, movement. Again, trust me, when y'all get old, you'll understand. And then after 2 or 3 weeks, I would bump the volume, but I would also I would add sets, but I would reduce the volume. So what I did initially is I would do one set of 8 to 12, or it might have been a 10 to 15, I don't remember. And as I got the cobwebs out, I would gradually add weight. And at some point, I got to the point where one set of 12 was fine, and I was ready to bring in a second set. So what I did was the following. So like I said, I started with, one set of 8 to 12 starting light, and I just started adding weight very gradually, every couple of workouts. And I did that for, I don't know, 3 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever. So let's say on workout 8, on some exercise, I did 100 pounds or kilos or units or whatever was on the fucking machine and got 12 with a couple reps in reserve. Well, at workout 9, I would keep the weight the same, and I would drop back, and I did 100 for 2 sets of 8. So basically the intensity stayed the same, and I bumped the number of sets, and I marginally increased my total rep count from 12 to 16. And then workout 10 plus, I just started doing a double progression, just like I described, of that same weight, 2 by 8 to 12. When I got to 2 sets of 12, I would go up, etc., etc., etc. And then at some point down the road, I got to 2 sets of 12 and decided, all right, I want to move to 3 sets. So whatever weight I used for 2 by 12, I would drop back and I would do 3 by 8 at that weight, and then I would start double progressing it. And I know I never went past 3 sets per exercise because I'm lazy and old and just in maintenance. And at some point I moved to my reps because fuck it, I can't be bothered to be in the gym for that long. But again, this is not strictly a triple progression, because at no point did I hit a top end of volume and weight and then drop back to the initial volume and build back up. So this is just me being thorough and crazy. So again, I don't really use set progressions except in very rare occasions, which are beginners who need to start with low volumes and build up as they develop fitness, assuming it meets their goals, or the occasion where someone's coming off of a layoff and needs to train as a beginner again and rebuild their work capacity, etc. All right, I'm done now. That's that as far as how to progress either a single progression or double progression across multiple sets. In both cases, you basically have 2 predominant options. The first one is to wait until you get the final set at whatever your target intensity is, or whenever it feels easy enough, and you add weight to all the sets. I would typically do that in lower repetition ranges for heavy competition work, squat, bench, deadlift for power lifters. I don't train Olympic lifters, but I would do the same thing. Assistance work, good mornings, RDL, stuff like that. I just use a single progression. I add weight when the final set looks easy enough that I can, assuming that I have the weight increments necessary, and since I have microplates in my training. So microplates we do. You can also, typically more of a higher repetition range, you can adjust the sets individually, where when the first set hits your target, meaning that you've adapted to the point that it's easier, that you add weight. In the single progression, it's when that first set of, say, 8 is now goes from being 2 reps in reserve to 3 or 4 reps in reserve, you add weight. And then you keep the subsequent sets at the previous weight till they adapt to the same point. The same thing applies for the double progression. Difference being, I generally wouldn't use double progression in very low repetitions, 5 to 8 at the very lowest, and then only on certain movements in extremely high skilled individuals. The average squatter is not going to safely double progress a squat without their technique falling to shit. If they're really skilled, maybe. But a hack squat, leg press, any compound movement that can be done safely, technically, can be double progressed. Same thing. You can either wait until you get the final set of your double progression at the top end of the rep range to add weight to all sets, or you can adjust them individually, which will lead into the next video I'm going to do, which is how, going back to that percentage thing, that 2 to 3% per rep, and how you can use that during the workout to adjust your sets based on what's actually happening. See you next time. For the record, I neither read nor respond to comments on YouTube or Instagram because I don't care. Mind you, I don't delete comments I don't like most of the weak-minded babies in this industry either. If you think my content is great and want to tell me how awesome I am, fantastic. If you think I'm a dumb asshole and want to call me names, also fantastic. I don't care either way, because I have better things to do. If you have questions that you want me to potentially read and or respond to, or most likely ignore, send them to questions@bodyrecomposition.com. Might get to them, might not. It's part of my charm. Oh yeah, I recently added a playlist to my channel. My buddy Solomon Nelson, who does some fantastic videos taking down the cretins in this industry. Point you to his newest video, which is short for those of you with a short attention span, addressing Mike Israetel's completely moronic claim that sleep is more powerful than anabolic steroids. And you'll see the thing come up in the end card. I highly recommend you check out his channel.